watch the recording, won't they? All right. So we are going to read chapter 18 today. I'm so excited. I love this book so much. All right. Remember, he got his new nickname, got his instrument case. He was cleaning, and he heard the band, and he's like, oh my God, this is the best sound ever. It's amazing. Now we are on chapter 18, 204. We got into 2 cars to drive for an hour and a half north of Grand Rapids. We were headed to a dinky town called Mikasto. I got to ride with the band while Mr. Jimmy and Hermione Calloway and the instruments were riding in the Packard. Miss Thomas stayed back at Grand Calloway Station. I'd been living with Miss Thomas in the band for about 7 days, and this was already my 3rd trip on the road. So that's how busy the band is, okay? They are busybodies. He's only lived with them for a week, and he's already on their 3rd trip. The band was doing their next favorite thing to play music. They were teasing each other and talking about Hermione Calloway behind his back. The thug said to Dirty Deed, I'd be offended, ma'am, and I ain't trying to say that you ain't good on the 88s, but you know the only reason you got this gig because you're Dutch, you're white, and you don't have the strongest personality in the world. Deed said, yeah, well, such is life. I think I'm going to give up. You think I'm going to give up the best gig in the state just because you'd be offended? Take a look out the window, baby. There's a depression going on. How many folks you see living like us, Negro or white? Not many. That man may have his faults, but he's a struggler. I'm putting my hat in with him. So, fun fact, during the Great Depression, there's still a lot of segregation going on and a lot of different stuff between African American people and white people. So the fact that Hermione Calloway's band has a white person in it, that means they get to play at more venues. So having a white person is like important to the band. So the thug is saying like, you're only in the band because you're white and we need you. And Dirty Deed's like, I don't care. I want this job and I'm going to stay with it. Eddie looked at me and said, Bud, Mr. C has always got a white fella in the band for practical reasons, but we don't hold his skin color against him. He can't help that he was born that way. Deed said, you're just too kind, Edward. Eddie kept talking. We do that because the boy can play. Mr. C won't compromise on his music. I said, why does he always keep one white guy in the band? Deed said, it's the way of the world, Sleepy. It's against the law for a Negro to own any property out where the log cabin is, so Mr. C put it in my name. Eddie said that, and a lot of times we get gigs playing polkas and waltzes, and there's a lot of white folks won't hire us if they knew we were a Negro band. So Deed goes out and sets up everything. But what do they say when the Dusky Devastators show up? Deed says, well, it's too late for them to say anything then, so it's us or no music. Eddie said, and Mr. C tells them, if we aren't the best band they'd ever have, then they don't have to pay. We haven't been stiffed yet. With all the arguing and joking about Mr. C, the trip seemed real short. We unloaded all the instruments and waited for nighttime to come. I'd heard the band play and practice 1,000 times and still had just about to sit on my hands when they were finished so I wouldn't bust out clapping. We finished our set at a little place called the Laughing, bad word that Mrs. Kleinfeld doesn't want to say, but anyways, that's the name of the place. And I got to sleep right on stage to guard the instruments. The next morning, I was packing everything into the cases when I got some real bad news. Hermione Calloway told Mr. Jimmy, I'm going to stay and catch up with Eugene. You head back with the boys. The man who owned the club, Mr. Eugene Miller, used to be in one of Mr. C's bands. Jimmy said, Bud, you take your time loading everything in the Packard, and you can ride back with Herman. Uh-oh. Me and Mr. C looked at each other like this wasn't a good idea. He said, whatever, and walked back to the club's office. Okay, so now there's going to be an hour and a half car ride of just Bud and Hermione Calloway. And remember, Hermione Calloway has done a really good job staying away from Bud up until now. Shucks. A whole hour and a half trapped in a car with him. I loaded all the instruments in the Packard, sat on a big rock, and took out my recorder to practice. I could hear Mr. C and Mr. Miller talking and laughing for the longest time. At last, Hermione Calloway came out and walked over to the side of the building and started nudging things around with the toe of his shoe. I walked over to watch what he was doing. When I got next to him, I could see that it was just rocks he was pushing around. Finally, he grunted a couple of times, started to bend over, but his big belly got in the way, wouldn't let his arms reach the ground. After a bunch more grunts, he said, "Make yourself useful, boy, and hand me this one." "This what, sir?" "This stone, this one." Right at the end of Mr. C's shiny brown shoe was a little roundish rock. I bent over to pick it up, blew some dirt off of it, turned it over a couple times in my hand to see why Mr. C thought it was so special. The only thing I could tell was that he'd picked a perfect throwing rock, the exact same kind of rocks I'd use if I was about to chuck someone in the head. I dropped it in his hand. He didn't look at it or nothing. He just stuck it in his pocket. I heard it bang against some silver dollars. I kept my nose out of his business for as long as I could. Then I had to say, "Mr. C, wasn't that just a rock?" "Sure was." He started walking back to the Packard. I followed. There were a million ways to ask what I wanted to know, and I chose the worst one when I said, "What in the Sam Hill are you going to do with the doggone rock?" So he could have been like, "Oh, why do you want the rock?" But he's like, "What in the Sam Hill?" Like saying, like, "Man, you're crazy. Why do you want this rock?" It sounded a lot meaner than I wanted it to, but it really surprised Mr. C would want an old rock. He climbed in on one side of the Packard, and I climbed in on the other. After he stuck the key in the dashboard, he said, "Bad habit." Then he leaned over toward me and opened the glove box of the car. There weren't any gloves or maps or papers in it, just a bunch of perfect throwing rocks. They all looked like they had writing on them. I reached in and took one of the rocks out. Written on the back was Idlewood, Michigan, 5236. I took another one and it said Preston Inn, 6436. These were just like my rocks. I took one more. It said Chicago IL 31932. So remember, those rocks in Bud's suitcase have writing on it. And these rocks that Mr. C has writing on it. Remember, those rocks he found in his mom's stuff. So, connection. Oh, snap. I looked over at Mr. C and said, "I've got some of these, sir." He said, "Really? I've got some too." He looked at me, shifted his pipe away from the talking side of his mouth and said, "Bud, I know you're not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but those are found all over the world. In fact, they're about as common as rocks." Get it? Because they're rocks. I almost didn't answer him, but since I didn't want to look stupid, I said, "Yes, sir, but mine have writings and numbers on them too." He said, We kept driving. Finally, I said to him, "You don't believe me, I'll show you." I dropped his 3 rocks back in the glove box and closed it, then climbed over the front seat to get my sax case. I found it and set it on the back seat and unlocked it. As soon as I opened the top, that smell of old spit and crumbling up velvet and mildew came rushing out, and it was still great. I lifted the little door that covered my rocks and took 2 of them out. I climbed back over the front seat and kept the rocks covered in my hand. If he was going to see these, he was going to have to ask first. I crossed my arms across my chest and waited. It's a good thing I've got patience, because I waited a long, long time. When we finally got back to Grand Callaway Station, Jimmy helped us unload the car. Finally, I decided that Mr. C had waited long enough. I stuck my rocks in his face and said, "See, I told you I had some rocks like those. The only difference is mine say Flint M.8.11.11 and Gary IN.6.13.12. He said, "Where did you find these? Didn't I tell you not to do any rummaging around in that room you've been sleeping in?" He reached for the rocks. I didn't know why, but I let him take him. He was the first person other than Bugs I'd ever let touch my rocks that my mama had given me. Mr. C turned the rocks over and over in his hands, and he said, "Well, where'd you get these?" Uh-oh. I could tell by the way Herman E. Callaway was holding my rocks. He didn't plan on giving them back to me anytime soon. I kept watching his hands, waiting for a chance to snatch my rocks and get out of there. If I could get my hands back on my rocks, I knew I could outrun Mr. C, even though he was a lot stronger and his legs were a lot longer than mine. Herman E. Callaway said, "Answer me! Where did you take these from?" Mr. C sounded meaner than he ever had before. Mr. Jimmy heard him and put down the box he was carrying and walked over to us real quick. Herman E. Callaway had the rock squeezing tight in his right hand fist and let his left hand fist balled up like he was ready to fight. Jimmy said, "Herman, what's this? What's wrong?" He stood between me and Mr. C. Herman E. Callaway said, "I told you about this boy from the word go. He's been snooping through the things in the house, and he's got no business being in. He stole these." I said, "No, sir, I did not." Mr. C said, "Then where'd you get them? I'm not going to ask you again." He unsqueezed the rocks in his hands. I was surprised he hadn't turned them into diamonds or dust the way he'd been holding them so tight. Mr. Jimmy took my 2 rocks from him. He looked at the writing and said, Flint, Michigan, August 8th, 1911, and Gary, Indiana, July 13th, 1912. That's more than 25 years ago. He squatted down and looked at me and said, Son, where'd you find these? Just tell the truth. I kept one eye on Mr. C. He still looked like he was getting ready to jump funny on me. I said, Mr. Jimmy, I didn't find them or steal them from nowhere. These always been mine. I got them from my mama, and that's the swear for God truth. Now, can I please have my rocks back, sir? I stuck my hand out. Both Jimmy and Mr. Herman said, Your mama? Yes, sir. I kept my hand out. Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, where did your mama get these? I said, I don't know, sir. She's always had them. Mr. Jimmy and Herman E. Calloway were looking at me with that can't decide which hand to smack you with look when Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, what did you say your mama's name was? No one ever asked me, sir. Herman E. Calloway was still hot. You throw a lot of sirs around, but you still got your real strong, real smart mouth, disrespectful streak in you, boy. Now you answer the question or I'll... I screamed at him, Angela, sir. I was so mad that I hadn't meant to say sir, but it came out anyway. Her name was Angela Janet Caldwell. Mr. Jimmy said, Lord have mercy. Herman E. Calloway's pipe dragged out of his mouth, and he fumbled into Grand Calloway Station, feeling his way like he'd been struck blind. Then I knew Herman E. Calloway was the best liar in the world. He'd been lying to me and everybody else all along. Now that there was some good proof against him, he was all shook up. I said to Mr. Jimmy, I knew it. I knew he was my father. Mr. Jimmy, still crouched down right in front of me, said, Bud, he's not your father. Yes, sir, he is. That's why he run off like that. He got caught lying after all these years. Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, that's enough. Herman is not your father, but Angela Janet is his daughter's name. If what you're saying is true, Lord help us all, it looks like Herman might be your grandfather. This was real surprising, but the thing I felt most was glad that Herman E. Calloway wasn't my dad. Shucks. Who'd want a daddy that on top of being so old and so doggone mean had such a big belly? Not me. All right, we're going to stop there. So it is official that Herman E. Calloway is not Bud's father, but his grandfather. So Angela Janet was Bud's mother's name, and coincidentally was Herman E. Calloway's daughter's name, which, remember, if Herman hasn't been talking to his daughter, that means he just found out that his daughter's passed away, right? Because Bud said his mom died 4 years ago. So we are going to...
tables have turned.
All right, craziness. We're going to stop there. You still have some time before Math RTI. So during this time, I want you to read for AR or work on any later missing reading RTI work, okay?
I bet if Herman E. Calloway would have known that he had a grandson out there and that if his daughter had passed and he knew, I bet he would have taken Bud in from the jump without him having to go through the whole foster care system.
Right, but apparently it seems like Herman E. Calloway doesn't know at all. So we'll probably find out in the next chapter if he ever knew, if he knew his daughter had passed away. I'm excited to read chapter 19 tomorrow with you guys. But in the meantime, go read for AR or work on later missing work. I will see you guys in Math RTI or reading later. Okay?
Or your chapter titles.
Okay, bye.
Bye.